Since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, one of the less discussed but crucial players in the region has been Belarus. Strategically located between Russia and Ukraine, this country has played a significant role in shaping the dynamics of the conflict. But how exactly has Belarus influenced this war, and what are the implications of its involvement for the broader geopolitical landscape? In this video, we'll take a closer look at Belarus's role, the motivations of its leadership, and the wider consequences of its actions in the Russia-Ukraine war. To understand Belarus's role in the Russia-Ukraine war, it's essential to first appreciate its position in the post-Soviet space. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Belarus has remained one of the closest allies of Russia. Under the leadership of President Alexander Lukashenko, who has been in power since 1994, the country has maintained a tight-knit relationship with Moscow. Belarus's political, economic, and military reliance on Russia has been substantial, with both countries being part of various economic and security agreements, such as the Union State and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO. Lukashenko's regime has often leaned on Russian support to maintain stability and resist internal opposition. This dependency on Moscow has defined much of Belarus's foreign policy, and as tensions between Russia and Ukraine escalated, Belarus found itself caught between its historic ties with Russia and the evolving geopolitical landscape in Eastern Europe. Belarus occupies a strategically critical location, bordering both Russia and Ukraine. This geographical position makes Belarus a potential launchpad for military operations and a key logistical hub. For Russia, the proximity of Belarus to Ukraine's northern border has provided a major strategic advantage. When the Russia-Ukraine war intensified in February 2022, Belarus immediately became a vital player in the conflict. Russian forces used Belarusian territory as a staging ground for the initial assault on Kyiv, Ukraine's capital. The northern route allowed Russian forces to launch a multi-pronged invasion, seeking to quickly take control of Kyiv and destabilize Ukraine's government. Lukashenko, while maintaining a public posture of neutrality early on, had effectively allowed his country to become a base for Russian military operations. Belarusian airfields, railways, and roads were utilized by Russian troops and military equipment in their push southward into Ukraine. The use of Belarusian territory marked a turning point in the war, as it opened a second front and forced Ukraine to defend a larger swath of territory, stretching its military resources. Lukashenko's involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war has not been without its complexities. While Belarus has not officially declared war on Ukraine, its role as a supporter of Russia's military operations has made it an implicit participant in the conflict. The Lukashenko government has consistently denied that Belarusian troops have been directly involved in combat, but there have been reports of Belarusian logistics and intelligence support to Russian forces. Lukashenko has tried to walk a tightrope between outright involvement and maintaining a semblance of sovereignty. He faces significant domestic and international pressure. On one hand, he needs to appease Moscow, which has been vital to his regime's survival, especially after the 2020 Belarusian presidential election, which was widely viewed as fraudulent. Following that election, mass protests erupted in Belarus, and Lukashenko's regime only survived thanks to Russian economic and political support. On the other hand, direct military engagement in Ukraine risks further destabilizing Belarus internally. Public opinion in Belarus regarding the Russia-Ukraine war is divided. While there is a pro-Russian segment of the population, particularly among older generations and the political elite, many Belarusians, especially younger people, have expressed opposition to the war and solidarity with Ukraine. Lukashenko's regime has been careful not to alienate this portion of the population completely, as it could provoke unrest and weaken his already tenuous grip on power. The war in Ukraine has had significant ramifications for Belarus domestically. Lukashenko's decision to support Russia has isolated his regime from much of the international community. Belarus has been subjected to sanctions from Western countries, which have targeted its key industries, such as potash production and oil refining. These sanctions, in combination with those imposed on Russia, have further strained Belarus's already fragile economy. Moreover, the war has galvanized the Belarusian opposition. Many opposition figures have condemned Lukashenko's complicity in the conflict, accusing him of sacrificing Belarusian sovereignty to appease Russia. The exiled opposition leader, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, has emerged as a vocal critic of Lukashenko's policies, rallying international support for the Belarusian democratic movement. This opposition movement, though weakened after the brutal crackdown following the 2020 election, has the potential to gain momentum if Lukashenko continues to entangle Belarus in the war. The prospect of Belarusian troops being sent into Ukraine has also sparked controversy. Though Lukashenko has so far refrained from committing Belarusian soldiers to the battlefield, such a decision would likely trigger widespread discontent within the country. The Belarusian military, though closely linked with Russia's, is not particularly large or well equipped, and any significant losses in Ukraine could undermine Lukashenko's standing with the military and the public. An important aspect of Belarus's role in the Russia-Ukraine war has been the actions of Belarusian exiles and activists opposed to the war. Since the 2020 protests, many Belarusians have fled the country to avoid persecution. Some of these exiles have taken an active stance against both Lukashenko's regime and the war in Ukraine. Belarusian volunteer fighters have joined Ukrainian forces to defend the country against Russian aggression. One notable example is the Kastis Kalinowski Battalion, a unit made up of Belarusian volunteers fighting on the side of Ukraine. Named after a 19th-century Belarusian national hero who fought against Russian imperialism, the battalion symbolizes the growing divide between the Lukashenko regime and the Belarusian people who seek closer ties with Europe and reject Russia's influence. These Belarusian volunteers view the war as part of a larger struggle for democracy and self-determination. For them, defeating Russia in Ukraine is also a step towards freeing Belarus from Lukashenko's authoritarian rule and loosening the country's dependence on Moscow. Their participation in the war underscores the internal divisions within Belarus and highlights the potential for long-term consequences for Lukashenko's regime. Belarus's role in the Russia-Ukraine war also has implications for the broader geopolitical context in Eastern Europe and beyond. By allowing Russian forces to operate from its territory, Belarus has effectively aligned itself with Moscow's vision of reshaping the post-Cold War European security order. This has caused alarm among NATO members and neighboring countries like Poland and Lithuania, who see Belarus as a potential threat to regional stability. In response, NATO has bolstered its presence in Eastern Europe, particularly in countries bordering Belarus. The Baltic states and Poland, already wary of Russian aggression, have viewed Belarus's involvement in the war as further evidence of the need for a strong defensive posture. This increased militarization of the region has heightened tensions, leading to a renewed focus on security and defense cooperation among NATO allies. Belarus's role in the conflict has also drawn the attention of countries outside of Europe. The United States and its allies have taken a more assertive stance against Lukashenko's regime, imposing sanctions and supporting the Belarusian opposition. Meanwhile, China has sought to maintain a delicate balance, supporting Russia diplomatically while trying to avoid direct involvement in the conflict. Beijing has maintained cordial relations with Minsk, but it remains cautious about fully endorsing Belarus's actions in the war. As the war in Ukraine drags on, the role of Belarus remains fluid. Several possible scenarios could unfold, depending on the trajectory of the conflict and the actions of Lukashenko's regime. One possibility is that Belarus could become more deeply involved in the war if Lukashenko's grip on power weakens or if Moscow demands greater participation. This could involve the deployment of Belarusian troops to Ukraine or more direct military support for Russian operations. Such a move, however, would come at great political risk for Lukashenko, both domestically and internationally. Another scenario is that Belarus could seek to distance itself from the conflict, especially if the war turns against Russia or if Lukashenko senses an opportunity to assert more independence. This would likely require a delicate balancing act, as Lukashenko cannot afford to alienate Moscow completely without jeopardizing his regime's survival. Lastly, the collapse of the Lukashenko regime could radically alter Belarus's role in the region. If opposition forces were to take power, Belarus might pursue a more pro-European foreign policy, potentially aligning with Ukraine and seeking to escape Russia's sphere of influence. However, such a transition would be fraught with challenges, and Russia would almost certainly intervene to prevent such an outcome. In conclusion, Belarus's role in the Russia-Ukraine war is complex and multifaceted. While Lukashenko has stopped short of full military involvement, his regime has provided crucial support to Russia's war effort. This support has come at a cost, isolating Belarus internationally and exacerbating internal divisions. As the war continues, Belarus's future remains uncertain, and the actions of its leadership will have far-reaching implications for the country and the broader region. Belarus's involvement in the conflict underscores the broader struggle for influence in Eastern Europe, as Russia seeks to maintain its dominance and the West rallies to support Ukraine's fight for sovereignty. What happens next will depend on the decisions made in Minsk, Moscow, and Kyiv, and their outcomes could reshape the geopolitical landscape for years to come.